attic of the Vanishing. The first thing Mara noticed was the smell. It was not only dust or old paper, it was a memory given a temperature, like the way sunlight heats an old photograph. She had come back to empty the house on Willow Lane and sign the papers everyone said were the last practical thing to do. The neighbors used the word tidy, the lawyer used signatures, but the attic insisted on a different vocabulary. When she pushed open its door, the light thinned, and something patient exhaled. Inside the attic, the scale was wrong. Sloped rafters too close to the head, trunks stacked like patient animals. Boxes bore her childhood handwriting and her father's neat carpenter's scrawl. On a low table, a small carved wooden box sat as if it owned the room. Mara traced its lid and felt it pulse faintly under her fingers, not with heartbeat, but with the small insistence of a thing that expects to be recognized. She could not explain the cold that followed. At night, she slept in the living room, and the house listened. The radiator clicked like somebody shifting. Floors settled in old arguments. In the mornings, she learned that neighbors remembered different facts. Eli, who had brought over a casserole, and his condolences, could not remember the name of her high school best friend. He laughed it off, but the laugh sounded clipped. The photograph on the mantel had a gap, a missing figure where someone had been cropped out by time or intention. Objects began to change their minds. A teacup moved from the kitchen shelf to the attic cart. A book she was sure she had put on the bedside table reappeared in a box labeled winter linens. Each misplacement felt intimate, as if the house were trying to tidy away specific memories. Mara kept a list, a crude ledger of small losses. Each time she wrote a line, the ink crawled cold across the page. Each time she read back what she had recorded, a word or two would be smudged, as though some small thing objected to being remembered so plainly. She found the brass skeleton key beneath a chair in the parlor, its ribbon frayed like an old promise. The key did not fit the obvious locks. It resonated with the attic, which was the obvious place for anything that refused to name itself. When Mara held the key up to the attic light, the metal drank the glow and returned only a faint impression of what it had touched. At night, she dreamed of a long corridor of doors, each with the same keyhole, each opening onto a room made of someone else's memory. Eli's forgetfulness sharpened. He began missing appointments and, more worrying, details of conversations he had shared with Mara for years. He would call and ask about a neighbor's name or describe a dog that never existed. He apologized with a tenderness meant to soothe rather than explain. Mara watched him like a map she could not read, and when she asked whether the house had ever seemed odd to him, his face folded into a polite confusion. "You have been here so much," he said, as if frequent exposure erased doubt. One afternoon, the carved box opened on its own. Mara found the lid tipped, a sliver of dark between it and the wood. Inside lay a photograph she had never seen, the family portrait, but with the missing figure present, smiling with a face she felt she should know. The edges were soft, as if learned memory had been carefully smoothed. She could not place the smile. Holding the photo felt like holding a word in a foreign language on the tip of her tongue. Recognition hovered, then withdrew, leaving a hollow ache shaped like an answer. Mara set up cameras, practical, modern interventions against a house that preferred old rules. The footage showed slight shifts: a box nudged, a curtain moved, a shadow lengthening where nothing had been. More alarming were the gaps: 10-second stretches of static where the image went soft, like heat haze. One sequence showed her entering the attic, then the feed cut, then resumed with the attic empty and the carved box closed. The soundtrack kept the low, patient exhale, as if the house were breathing in and slowly letting go. He began to test the boundaries of forgetfulness in quiet rituals. She put a coin on the mantle, then checked hours later to see whether it remained. Sometimes it stayed, sometimes it did not. Once, she placed an old-school charm in the carved box and found it replaced by a child's comb she no longer owned. The swapping was not malicious. It felt bureaucratic, as if the house had a filing system and she had misplaced the correct forms. The sense of being a borrower in her own life gnawed at her patience. Neighbors began to speak of the house in phrases that skirted the point. The mail carrier claimed the address was different last week. A delivery driver said the house had a different paint color this summer. Comments arrived like stray leaves, seeming unrelated, until Mara lined them up and saw the pattern. Small details sliding out of the world like stones pulled from a riverbed. She started to fear not only losing things, but being erased from the ledger of those who could be sure of things. At her lowest hour, she accused the attic of stealing. The accusation hung in the hollow, and the house answered by letting a whisper slip through the floorboards. It was not words as she knew them, but a texture of sound, like paper rubbed together. Mara climbed to the attic with the brass key and the photograph and set them side by side on the floor. She waited until the last veins of light left the rafters and listened as the house rearranged itself around the two objects, testing their right to remain. Something moved inside the box. A small panel slid open to reveal a thin, handwritten list of names. Her name was there, but the letters were slanting, as if written by a hand that had been afraid to stay. Beneath each name was a faint erasure, like footprints gone over by wind. When Mara looked up, the attic felt wider, as if an extra row of rafters had opened to accommodate a different geometry. She understood that the house did not only hide things, it rearranged who belonged to what story. The night she almost left for good, Eli appeared at her door with trembling resolve. He had forgotten dinner plans, certain he had not, then remembered and apologized for something he could not name. He told Mara he had found a photograph of them as kids, a picture in which the two of them sat on a porch swing that did not exist in either of their memories. His hands shook when he handed it to her, and Mara recognized the exact ache she had been carrying. They watched each other as if testing the same fragile bridge. Mara made a choice that felt less like bravery and more like the last practical thing to do. She wound the brass key into the seam of the attic doorway and turned. The house answered with a hush, the kind that comes before a decision unravels. The door swung inward, not onto more boxes, but onto a narrow passage of impossible proportion, lined with tiny doors, each labeled in handwriting that looked like her father's. At the end of the passage was a door with no label, and through its crack, a soft, patient amber glow, as if all the rooms of the house were being lit from one singular lamp. She did not step through. Instead, she closed the door and slid the key back into the box, folding the photograph beneath it like a promise kept small. When she locked the attic, the house exhaled, and some of the small vanishings returned, as if summoned back by her refusal to let the pattern complete. Eli's memory of a neighbor's name came back in part. The photograph on the mantel seemed less hollow. But some things had already been altered. An afternoon she could no longer place, a laugh she could not recall precisely, and those gaps hummed like moths in a lamp, unreachable and patient. On her last morning, as she signed the final papers, Mara left the attic door cracked open a finger's breadth. The house was quieter now, its edginess softened, but not reversed. When she looked back once from the street, the attic window glowed a little differently, a sliver of amber like a watchful eye. She understood that some spaces keep working whether watched or not. The question that followed was not whether the house would continue, but whether the part of her that had been nudged away might, someday, find its own door and return on its own terms. The attic kept breathing,